Today's daf is daf Lamed Gimel, and we'll start with Lema Misayele on the second line. And we're talking about Ula, and Ula is of the opinion that Miktas Bia Shmei Bia. And the Torah says that if a Tameh enters into the Azara, he's Chayiv Kares. Ula says that that applies even if part of his body enters into the Azara, even if his hands go into the Azara. That too is a violation of Bias Migdash, Betuma. And Lema Misayele here on the top of Lamed Gimel is the Gemara is quoting a brisa to support the shita of Ula. Now, the background to this brisa is the mitzvah of smicha, which means that the person who brings a carbon, he has to lean on the head of the animal, and under normal circumstances, he would recite vidui. And the question here is, the smicha should take place in the Azara right before the shechita, which is in the Azara, or in the case of a carbon chatos, it would be in the tzafon of the Azara. Other carbonos could be anywhere in the Azara. So when he does his smicha and he's standing inside the Azara, he immediately is followed by the shechita of the Kohen. The Kohen shechts the animal, and that's called tekef l'smicha shechita. However, if he's a tameh, that's a problem because a tameh cannot enter into the azara. Now, there's a case of a mitzora who, as part of the process of his tahara, of his purification, he has to bring a carbon asham. Now, normally, in a case of a person who brings a carbon asham and he's not tameh, he's tar, he will go into the azara. But in the case of a mitzora, by virtue of the fact that he's tameh, and even though he's at the 8th day of his tara, but he still hasn't brought his karbanos, and he's called a mechusar kapara, and a mechusar kapara is not allowed to enter into the migdash. So therefore, kol asmichol shahayu sham, in regard to a tahar who comes in to bring a carbon, let it be even a carbon asham, it doesn't matter which carbon, he goes into the azara, and kori alemani takef l'smicha shchita. So he'll do the smicha on the animal, the carbon, while he's standing in the azar because he's tahar, and then followed immediately by the shchita. Chutz mizu, but in the case of a mitzora, on the 8th day of his process of tahara, and he hasn't yet fulfilled his obligation to bring all his karbanos, he's not allowed to enter into the azara. And the Brisa says that in this case, he's going to have to stand outside the azara in a place called the Shar HaNikanor, as we'll soon see. And from there, he does smicha. Then the animal is brought into the azara, but it's not going to be tekef l'shchita, tekef l'smicha shchita, because there's going to be a pause, an interruption until from the time that he does the smicha outside the azara, because he's not allowed to enter into the azar until the moment of shchita. So haisa b'shara nikarna. So where did the mitzora perform his and fulfill his obligation of smicha? At a place called the Shar HaNikanor. The Shar HaNikanor was on the Harabayis, but it was not in the Azara. It was close to the Azara, very close to the Azara, and it was even close to the tzafon of the Azara. But the question is, since he cannot enter into the Azara, we want to bring him to a location which is as close as possible to the Azara, but yet is outside the Azara. And that's going to be the Shar HaNikanor. So that's where he's going to perform this Mitzvah is going to perform his smicha. And he cannot go into the Azor. She'ein Mitzvah yochel likonis l'sham ad shemazan olav midam chatoso umidam ashama. The Mitzvah on the 8th day of his process of purification has to bring two korbanos. He's got to bring a korban chatos. He's got to bring a korban asham, and they will clinch his tara when some of the dam from the two korbanos, the asham and the chatos, is applied to his thumb and to his big toe, let's say. But that's going to be the clincher. He hasn't done that yet because they didn't even bring the korban asham at all. He's doing smicha, and therefore he's standing in the Shara Nikra outside of the Azor because he hasn't yet clinched his Tara insofar as he didn't have the Hazos Hadomim. Now, what is it about this brisa that supports Ula? Well, let's just think about it for a moment, and then we'll see the Gemara. If you would hold against Ula that Miktas Bia Lavshme Bia, which means that there's no violation if he puts his arms alone into the Azor as long as he's firmly grounded outside the Azor, then this brisa would make no sense. Why not allow the Mitzorah to do smicha, let him stand in the Shara Nikanor, which is right outside the Azorah, push his hands into the Azorah while his body is still in the Shara Nikanor outside the Azorah, and the fact that he's Tomei should not bother us because his body is still outside the Azorah. The only way of justifying the fact that in the case of the Mitzorah on his 8th day he cannot perform smicha inside the Azorah is because Bia b'miktas shmei bia. That means he would violate the Isur of Bias Migdash B'tuma if he put his hands inside the Azorah. And that supports Ula. As the Gemara points out here, if you're going to say that the Torah only prohibits a Tomei, if his entire body goes into the Azorah, but if only part of his body, let's say his hands, would go into the Azorah, that's not a problem because his body is outside the Azorah, and that would be the shita against Ula, then li'ayel yodei v'lismach. Why does the Brisa insists that in the case of a Mitzorah, there's no possibility of takef l'smicha shchita, which means that he'll do the smicha inside the Azorah, and then you'll have shchita? That could only be understood in the light of, or on the basis of, the principle of Ula, that bia b'miktas shmei bia, and therefore there's no opportunity for him to put his arms into the Azorah. That would be a violation of Bias Migdash B'tuma. Hence, he's got to stand outside the Azorah in the Shara Nikanor, and that's where he's going to do his smicha. But the Gemara rejects it. Omar Rav Yosef. Homani, who is the author of this brisa? Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehudahi. The Omar Merachak Tzafon, meaning that there's a machlokas tanoim exactly where, between Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi, exactly where the Shara Nikanor is in relationship to the Tzfon HaZorah. Now, a Kodshe Kodshim, which would include Chatos and Asham, requires that the Shechita be implemented in the Tzafon, in the north. Now, the sheet of Rebbe is that anywhere in the north is fine for the shechita of Kodshe Kodshim. And therefore, the shechita, if the Mitzorah were to put his hands from the Shara Nikanor into the Azorah, since the Shara Nikanor borders on the Tzafon, then according to Rebbe, what's the problem? If Bia b'miktas lav shmei bia, he could just put his arms in, and while he's standing in the Shar Nikanor, his shechita will be immediately after his smicha in the tzafon. But according to Rabbi Yossi has a different picture of what the tzafon is. And according to Rabbi Yossi, the tzafon is a strip in the northern part of the Harabayis that is parallel to the Mizbeach. Now, from the Shara Nikanor till you get to the Mizbeach is going to be a distance which makes it impossible for him to put his arms in and reach the area of Tzafon where the Shechita is going to be taking place. Now, if you want to know the calculations here, in my Gemara, there's a little bit of a diagram here. But basically, when you look at this diagram, and you'll see a strip that is straight across from the Mizbeach, then it turns out that from the Shara Nikanor all the way to that strip, which is called Safon according to Rabbi Yossi, is 22 amos. Now, 22 amos it's humanly impossible to stretch your arms in, so he's going to have to remain outside the Azorah. The only way, according to Rabbi Yossi, that it would be possible for this mitzorah to achieve the smicha and the shechita in the same location in the tzafon, in the case of the korban asham that the mitzorah has to bring, would be if his entire body went into the azorah. Nothing less would manage. So in truth, what Rav Yosef is pointing out over here is that if this brisa is to be attributed to Rav Yossi, then I could maintain that bia b'mixus lav shmei bia, but the only way he could do the smicha and then shchita samach l'smicha would only be if he would walk 22 amos from the Shara Nikanor to the part of the north where he could do the shchita. So in other words, there's no proof whatsoever, says Rav Yosef, that bia b'mixas shmei bia. Now the Gemara raises the following question: V'li avid pishpesh. Pishpesh is a small opening, a small a door. So the Gemara wants to know, I don't get it. Even according to Rabbi Yossi, we can easily solve the problem. Now it's true that the Shara Nikanor is far away from that part of the tzafon, which parallels the Mizbeach by 22 amos, but you could simply make a door on the side, and from there, the Metzora could do the smicha and immediately do the shechita, all in the same location. So if you hold that bia b'mixus lav shmei bia, the door is here. He puts his hand, or both of his hands actually, for smicha into the opening of the door. He's standing in the Shara Nikanor outside the Azorah, and immediately on that spot after smicha they do the shechita. And the Gemara now is going to quote a pasuk in Divrei Yomim, and I wish I could memorize this pasuk, because this pasuk is probably the most important pasuk to understand the structure of the Harabayis, the Azorah, the Chel, the Kodesh Kadoshim, etc., etc. There's an entire Masechta in Shas. It's not part of Daf Yomi. It's called Masechta Tomid. That's dedicated to the structure of the Harabayis. But the key of keys is here, lies in this pasuk in Divrei Yom. Abai v'Rav Diamri Chavayu, and now we're quoting this pasuk. Hakol b'ksav miyad Hashem. Now the author of Divrei Yomim is none other than David HaMelech, and David HaMelech says that they got a ksav, some sort of a written plan, what we call in modern Hebrew tachnit, that came from the Yad Hashem, and olai hiskil kol meleches hatavnis. And the key two words here are olai hiskil. Now, what these words mean, olai hiskil, which means that this ksav that David HaMelech received from Hashem would elucidate for David exactly where everything had to be located. It's a detailed plan, and all the works of the Mikdash have to follow that plan. There's no deviation whatsoever. And therefore, the Torah is telling us, through David HaMelech, that we are not allowed to deviate at all from the structure and the design of the Harabayis and the Mikdash, not even one iota from the way it was given to us through this ksav. And therefore, there is no way that we can make a door on the side of the Sharon Nicanor that would change the structure. We're not allowed to do so. Ika Diamri, now we have a second transmission or tradition of Rabbi Yosef. And why and how did Rabbi Yosef reject the proof from the Brisa to support Ula? Ika Diamri, Omer Rabbi Yosef, kol hasomech rosho v'ruba machnas. According to this second Ika Diamri tradition of Rav Yosef, what it turns out is that smicha is not putting two hands on the head of the animal. That's not sufficient. But rather he has to put the full force and weight of his body as he leans on the animal. And that's called, in the language of Rav Yosef, Rosho Verubo. Now, according to everybody, once it's Rosho Verubo, then that's considered Bias Migdash. And if he's Tameh, that's a Chiyuv Kares for Bias Migdash. My time, or what led Rav Yosef to draw this conclusion that smicha requires the entire body? And the Gemara answers, Kol kocho be'inon hilkach lo echshu. The reason why Rosho Verubo has to be pushed onto the head of the animal, the korban, in order to achieve smicha is because you need kol kocho. Kol kocho means the entire force or energy of his body. And for that you need that Rosho Verubo will lean over the korban. Okay, now the Gemara wants to know the following. In this sugya of the Mitzorah on the 8th day regarding his korban asham, there are two issues that overlap. One is the issue of smicha per se, and the other issue is the issue of shchita samach l'smicha, which is called tekev l'smicha shchita. Truth be told, and for me this was an eye-opener, neither of these two principles that are so critical here are clearly doraisa. I thought for sure they're both biblical requirements, but that's not so. And there are basically three options. One option is the one that we thought was intuitive, and that is that both Tekef l'shchita smicha and the requirement of smicha per se in the case of the korban asham of the Mitzorah are both principles d'oraisa. And now we have two other possibilities. We could say that shchita samach le smicha, or shall we call it tekef le smicha shchita, to use the Talmudic terminology, and is the Rabbanon, whereas smicha is d'oraisa, or the opposite, that maybe smicha is the Rabbanon, and the requirement of tekef le smicha shchita is d'oraisa. Now, the question arises. Smicha is certainly doraisa. It's explicit in the Torah. The Torah says, "V'savach yodo al rosh hapar." But there's one exception, and that's the mitzorah. In the entire matrix of korbanos, no doubt that smicha is doraisa. There's only one single korban that's an exception to the rule. Now let's understand why. Why should the asham of a mitzorah, according to one opinion, as we'll soon see, not require smicha according to biblical law? And the answer is because, as we said at the beginning of our discussion, every smicha is for the purpose of vidui. And even in the case of a korban olah, there still is vidui, because an olah is mechaper on a bittul essay. But in the case of a mitzorah, he's not bringing his korban for the purpose of kapara, for a sin. It's not a sin korban in any way oriented towards sin, but rather it's part of Tara. And therefore, smicha, which is connected to vidui, which is obviously connected to kapara for a sin, is l'chora unnecessary in the case of a mitzorah. So I'm just giving you that background. My kasava, what does the brisa hold regarding, number one, the chiyuv of smicha in the case of mitzorah, number two, the din of tekef l'smicha shchita? Ika savar smichas asham mitzorah doraisa, despite the fact that the korban asham of a mitzorah is so radically, fundamentally different than any other smicha, but nevertheless the Torah requires smicha straight across the board. It's a din in kodshim, it's a din in karbanos. The karban requires smicha. Doesn't matter, vidu ahin, vidu aher, whatever it is, it's irrelevant. V'tekev l'smicha shchita doraisa, and likewise, after the Torah requiring smicha, even for the mitzorah, he has to do the shchita immediately, which means in the same location as the smicha, is then leil v'lismoch lehedja. We have no problem here of bias migdash betuma. The Torah commands the mitzorah, A, to do smicha, and B, the smicha has to be in the same location where the shchita is, i.e., in the azara. So the Torah is telling us explicitly that the isur that normally applies of bias migdash is lifted. It's completely irrelevant in the case of a mitzorah. And this is what the Torah requires. If that be the case, the entire discussion in this brisa about setting up the smicha at the Shara Nikanor is totally out of place. So we now have to figure out, wave here, what is doraisa and what is not doraisa. Omar of Adavar Masna, Gzeira Shemiyarbe Psios. So Rav Adabar Ava Bar Masna accepts what I call the intuitive premises that we operated with, namely that both smicha and tekef l'smicha shchita are both doraisa principles that mandate that the mitzorah would certainly have to enter into the azara and not remain outside in the Shara Nikanor in order to fulfill the obligation that's imposed, that the Torah imposes upon him, namely to do smicha plus smicha samach l'shchita. But the problem that the brisa addresses is a gzera. What's the gzera? The Torah is allowing the mitzorah to do the barest minimum that is necessary for him to achieve and implement his responsibility of smicha. Immediately after he does the smicha, the Kohen takes over the shchita, the mitzorah has to retrace his steps and get the heck out of the azara. If he dwindles, if he takes his time and foot drakes and he goes this way and he goes that way, I want to see what the Azara looks like, I'm curious about the Mizbeach, he has all sorts of, maybe he wants to watch the Shchit, I don't know what. So the very moment that he takes an extra step, he is violating the Isur of Bias Migdash because he's Tameh. So they made a Gzeira and they said, you know what? do the smicha outside the Azora in the Sharanikah. Ikadiyamri. Now the Gemara has another transmission of Ada Bar Masna. Smichas Asha Mitzor Doraisa. Like any other carbon, which requires by biblical law smicha, the carbon asham of a mitzvah is like. However, takef l'smicha shchita lav doraisa. So that would mean that on a doraisa level, according to biblical law, the smicha doesn't have to take place in the azara. So therefore, when the Torah commands smicha, even to the mitzvah, the Torah is not saying that he has to go into the azara, because the Torah doesn't require that smicha take place in the azara, because the Torah doesn't recognize this principle of takef l'smicha shchita. So the smicha could take place out, because again, Rabbi, we always have to remember one thing in this sugya, that the only reason why smicha has to take place in the azara is not because smicha requires azara. That's not so. It's only because the shchita has to take place immediately following the smicha, and they both have to take place in the same location. But now we're holding that shchita could take place later on in a different location. So we go back to square one. Smicha doesn't have to be in the azara, and therefore the Torah never was matir the mitzora who's tummy to go into the azara, and therefore he stands in the Shara Nikudah. Meisveh. So the Gemara is not happy with this Rav Ada in the second Lishna to assume that Tekev L'smicha Shchita is not Doraisa. The Gemara says, Meisveh, V'samach V'shachat. As we had on Daf Lamed Aleph, or no, it was Lamed Beis, before the computer died on me, we had a Hekesh, where the Torah juxtaposes both smicha and shchita in the same context, and from that juxtaposition, we derive a hekesh. Ma smicha b'tahorim, af shchita b'tahorim. So we see that shchita and smicha are compared one to the other, and if they're compared one to the other, then the assumption is that just like shchita has to take place in the azara, the smicha also has to take place in the azara, and that's going to be a doraisa halach, because anything we derive from a hekesh is doraisa. Ve'iyamrit lav doraisa, according to you, Rav Ada Bar Masna, who claim that on a doraisa level the shchita will take place in the azara, but the smicha outside the azara, because the Torah doesn't require takev l'smicha shchita, is bitmeim nami mishkachasla. Why can't we avoid this whole problem by having the mitzora perform his smicha outside of the azara, and then we'll bring the carbon and kick it off with shchita in the azara? So, the Bryce is assuming that smicha requires that a person be tar. Why? Ma smicha b'tahorim af shchita b'tahorim. Why is smicha requiring tahorim? The answer is because smicha has to take place in the azara, and he has to be tar because otherwise he's not allowed to enter into the azara. But now I'm going to tell you no. Let the Tameh do smicha outside the azara, because according to you, Rav Ada, in the second interpretation, takef l'smicha shchita is only the Rabbanan. So the Torah doesn't require that the smicha take place in the azara. If the smicha doesn't have to take place in the azara, then let the bala karban be a tameh. Why does he have to be a tar? So at this point, the Gemara actually rejects the second transmission of Rav Ada and reformulates it in the opposite way. Ela epuch, turn it inside out. Smichas Osha Mitzorel Havdoraisa. And this, as I said, is a fascinating idea that the Asham Mitzorah is fundamentally different from every other carbon that requires smicha because it's not for the purpose of kapara. It's for the purpose of tara. So the entire requirement of smicha in the case of an Asham Mitzorah is only the Rabbanan. Take it with smicha l'shchita doraisa. Which means that if takev l'smicha shchita, then the smicha has to take place in the Azara. Now, if, again, as we said over and over again, if the smicha has to take place in the Azara because takef l'smicha shchita, then a tameh is out of business. He cannot possibly do smicha because he's not allowed to enter into the Azara. And in the case of the Mitzorah, that therefore, perforce, he has to stand in the Sharon Nicanor in order to do the smicha. Okay, all this is before Ravina, and now we get to Ravina.